Hello, friends. In the darkness of the night, Louise noticed her bedroom door opening by itself. As she peeked outside, a shadow appeared that resembled her mother, but her face held a strange, unsettling smile. The shadow gradually began to rise into the air. The film begins with an elderly woman living alone with her ailing husband. Her husband's condition is severe, and she must care for him entirely on her own. One day, while she is working on some sewing in her room, she hears a sudden noise coming from the room. When she rushes to check on her husband, she is struck with terror. At the same moment, their sheep, seemingly disturbed by something extraordinary, panic and scatter while bleating loudly. This terrifying presence was a malicious spirit that had invaded their farm. On another day, while the woman is working in the kitchen, the chair behind her suddenly moves backward. Witnessing this, she realizes that the spirit is nearby. The next day, her son Michael and daughter Louise visit their parents. The conversations between the siblings reveal a strained relationship with their mother. The elderly woman urges her children to leave the house but refrains from telling them about the spirit inhabiting their home. That night, Louise and Michael sit outside and talk, admitting how consumed they were with their own lives, leaving no time to care for their parents. They come to realize that their parents needed their love and attention. When Louise enters her room that night, the door opens by itself. She sees a demonic entity standing there, visible only to her mother. During dinner, their mother warns Michael that the house is not safe and that something sinister resides there. She advises them to leave immediately, but Michael dismisses her concerns and goes to his room. The following morning, Louise and Michael find their mother's lifeless body after she has committed suicide in the barn. Both siblings are devastated. A neighbor, who is a close friend of their mother, mourns the tragedy. A nurse is hired to care for their father. The nurse mentions that their mother was often seen talking to someone unseen, as if she were conversing with an invisible presence. This revelation leads Louise to ponder the hardships her mother endured. She begins to regret leaving her mother alone during her darkest times and decides to take full responsibility for their father's care. Louise enters the room where her mother used to sew and discovers that her mother was making a wedding gown for her. Overwhelmed with sorrow, Louise becomes even more grief-stricken. While taking a bath, she hears footsteps approaching. She calls out, "Michael, is that you?" but receives no response. When she draws the curtain aside, she finds her father standing there. His appearance is haunting. His eyes are completely white, and he is trembling uncontrollably. Terrified, Louise screams loudly. Michael hears her screams and rushes to the bathroom, but no one is there when he arrives. What Louise experienced was hard to forget, yet she tried to convince herself that it was merely an illusion. Michael was preparing to go out to purchase some essentials. Before leaving, he decided to check on their father. There, Michael found a diary belonging to his mother. Michael shared this discovery with Louise, and together they began reading it. In the diary, their mother had written about a terrifying ghost haunting their home, slowly taking the life of their father and now targeting her. This revelation left Louise and Michael stunned. They started linking the diary entries with the recent incidents that had occurred in the house. They tried to understand why their mother had suddenly taken her own life. The diary mentioned that their mother had sensed the ghost's presence and could even hear its voice. The siblings visited a doctor who was examining their mother's body. The doctor handed them a cross that had been found in their mother's pocket. This surprised Michael and Louise greatly, as their mother had never been particularly religious. Later that night, while caring for their father, Louise noticed that he was coughing and that a spider crawled out of his mouth. Startled, Louise tried to hide this from Michael when he arrived. When Michael went to his room to sleep, the lights began flickering on and off by themselves. He went to the window and was shocked to see his mother floating in the air, smiling at him. The light in his room went out, and he started hearing his mother's voice. When he looked outside, no one was there. The next day, when Louise entered the bathroom, she was alarmed to find lipstick marks on her face in the mirror. She hurriedly tried to wipe it off. When she went to check on her father, she found lipstick near him. This added to her growing confusion as she couldn't understand what was happening in the house. At that moment, the house phone rang. Louise picked it up and heard a recording stating that the house's telephone lines would be cut off. After hanging up, another call came in. This time, Louise heard her mother's voice instructing her to leave the house immediately. When Michael returned, he saw a priest outside the house. The priest told them that he knew their mother because she had often visited him. He gave them his number and said, "If you need help, call me." This made both siblings suspicious, wondering if the priest had planted ideas about the ghost in their mother's mind. Michael asked him to leave. After the priest left, Michael called his wife and children, telling them he missed them very much. Meanwhile, Louise was reading her mother's diary in the farmhouse when she suddenly heard the sound of glass breaking. She thought Michael might have broken something, but when she turned around, there was no one there. At that moment, she saw a demonic shadow on the wall. Louise became convinced that her mother's warnings were true. When she told Michael, he admitted that he, too, now believed her. He shared how he had seen their mother floating in the air at night. A while later, when they returned to the house, they felt like something was outside. They heard scratching noises as well. When they looked outside, they saw the priest standing there, but his eyes were completely white. They realized that it wasn't the priest, but the same ghost who could take on any form. The neighbors called Michael and Louise for help, but when Louise answered the phone, it suddenly cut off. At the same time, we see the ghost preparing to attack the neighbor. He arrived at the neighbor's house and began cutting her face and body with a knife in front of him. Seeing this, the neighbor realized that this was not the real Louise. The spirit came closer and whispered something in the neighbor's ear. Under its influence, the neighbor ended his life. This revealed that the spirit used its dark power to force people into taking their own lives, as it had done with Louise's mother and now with the neighbor. The next morning, the siblings stepped outside the house to find out if the priest had indeed visited during the night. They searched for footprints but found none. Realizing the severity of the situation, they decided to send their father to the hospital. Louise called the priest to learn more about her mother. The priest, surprised, asked, "Where did you get my number?" Louise replied, "You came to our house yourself and gave it to us, saying that you knew our mother." Shocked, the priest said, "I have never met your mother or you too. I live in another country." He further added, "I once had a daughter named Louise, who took her own life. Coincidentally, your voice sounds very similar to hers." Hearing this, Louise became extremely anxious and immediately hung up the phone, as she felt dizzy from the conversation. Now Louise and Michael consulted a doctor about sending their father to the hospital. After examining him, the doctor said he was very weak and that traveling might endanger his life. He advised keeping him at home. A nurse reassured them, saying, "I am confident he will recover." However, she also mentioned, "I saw your mother suffering in pain without both of you." When Louise and Michael went to the farm, they were horrified by the scene. Many animals were lying dead, their bodies brutally mutilated. They realized this couldn't have been the work of an ordinary animal. Suspicion about the spirit grew stronger. They lit a large fire and burned all the remains of the animals. These events left Michael deeply emotional. While caring for a pregnant animal, he said, "I won't let anything happen to you." At that moment, he decided to stay with his sister and father, as he didn't want to leave them alone in such dire circumstances. Michael confessed to Louise, "I have started feeling very scared of all this." Later, Michael heard a voice coming from inside the farmhouse. When he went to check, the spirit had taken the form of his mother. The spirit whispered something into Michael's ear, which almost drove him to take his own life. However, he managed to stop himself with sheer determination. That night, Louise had a terrifying nightmare. In the dream, she felt the presence of the spirit around her. Suddenly, she woke up in fear and saw her father clinging to the ceiling. This sight made her scream, but when she fully woke up, she realized it was also a dream. The next morning, Michael was nowhere to be found. Louise searched everywhere, only to discover that he had fled, leaving his sister and father behind to save himself. This broke Louise's heart. During this time, the neighbor's granddaughter came to meet Louise and said, "Your father's condition is worsening. However, Louise immediately understood that this wasn't the real granddaughter but the spirit in disguise. Meanwhile, the nurse taking care of their father began behaving strangely. She pierced a sharp object into her cheek. Louise tried to stop her, but the nurse knocked her unconscious. The nurse then brutally ended her life by piercing her nose and other parts of her body with sharp tools. Meanwhile, Michael reached his wife and children. Upon arrival, he discovered that all his family members had been killed. This shocking sight left him devastated, and he ended his life by slitting his throat. However, in his final moments, he saw that his family was actually alive. It was then that he realized everything had been an illusion crafted by the sinister spirit. When Louise was with her father, he began coughing violently. In the midst of this, Michael's voice echoed from inside the house. Her father's condition deteriorated further, and he eventually succumbed while struggling to breathe. Louise, overwhelmed by grief, began to cry. Amidst her sobs, she heard her mother's voice. When she turned around, the spirit emerged from her father's body and attacked her, ultimately killing her as well. The entire family fell victim to the spirit because their mother had made a pact with it to fulfill her own mysterious purpose. In return, she had promised to hand over her family to the spirit. This deal allowed the spirit to reside in their home and gradually destroy each member of the family. Friends, if you like the story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and see you in the next video.